I am pleased to introduce to you today Linda Walvoord. She earned her BA at Hope College and her PhD at the University of Chicago. She taught at several universities and then retired from the University of Cincinnati. I think I mentioned last week that the first class I took as a HASP member was a writing class with Linda, and she let me know about the possibilities of this organization, which I've continued to enjoy and explore over the last few years. Thank you for this course today. It's always, as a committee chair, it's always a delight to get a course proposal in the email from Linda. And I know it's going to be a good one. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Let's pick up where we left off in the actual memoir, because as you recall, last week we were discussing a lot of background and used the PowerPoint. So I'm going to leave this up here to remind you of Carl's picture, which I assume, since somebody's next to him, came from a Hope College yearbook. And so he would have graduated in 1942, but as we know, he didn't get a chance. So we're going to go forward in the memoir first and get your reactions to what you read about these three different camps where he served. And with the ending on page 2, he says, "I was full of trepidation about what was in store for me when he finally received orders from Selective Service to report to the Military Induction Center in Chicago, there to be processed for assignment to a CPS camp." So, as we stressed last week, he's under Selective Service. He's not a dodger, exactly. He's not a draft dodger, exactly. He's following the draft and a pathway that there is within the Selective Service law of 1940, where he can do what he is doing. But trepidation is what? Stone cold fear. Trepidation of what he's going to do. What were your reactions to the first camp that he goes to, Walhalla, right here in Michigan? Were you surprised by anything as you see him in this camp? Or do you see trepidation right here before you? Justified trepidation? Judy. Mike, Richard.
I think he felt like he was relieved in a way. I mean, he's still in Michigan. He's doing apple picking. It was very pleasant. It was a good introduction, I think, to his alternative service, let's say, to our country.
Okay, so a sense of relief. Any form of disappointment? How about $2.50 a month as his allowance for personal needs, such as toothpaste, stationery, and postage stamps, and phone calls? Well, $2.50 didn't go very far for a phone call if it was long distance, did it? Of course, this is money in 1941. And 5 cents will buy you a gigantic 2-scoop ice cream cone.
Do we know anything more about the Church of Brethren and their activity during the war?
Yes, we do. We find out a little bit more going through this. It's one of the recognized peace churches, what are called the peace churches, which would be Church of the Brethren, and he mentions them too. It would include Mennonites, which we'll get back to in a little bit. And what else? The other peace churches would be Quakers, and Orthodox Jewish was considered a peace denomination and could qualify through denomination. And it is I would say, mainline type of Protestant church. Would you agree with that, Doug? It's not a rare, strange religion that believes many different things, but it does hold the pacifism.
The Church of the Brethren, yeah, it's a mainstream denomination.
And definitely recognized as Christian, wouldn't you say?
Yes, yep.
How about I voluntarily paid the church $50 a month for the first 2 weeks I was in CPS. But I became aware that hardly anyone else was doing likewise. Most of the men had no money, and those who did could foresee that very soon the little they had would be depleted, and they then would be left totally dependent on the church or their families. The camp director at Walhalla, a Brethren minister, in other words, he's a chaplain for the whole group of men there, discouraged us from making payments to the church, pointing out that we would need the money when we would eventually be discharged when the war was over. How did Carl have this money? Yes, that. So, yeah.
The work that he did for his father, he was paid.
Okay, so his father, Tunis Verduin, paid him, even though it was his own son. His father paid him because he was over 18. He did that with all of his children. As soon as they reached adult age, they would be paid. Like, I don't know if it was more than what the migrant workers were making that worked for Tunis Verduin, but it's interesting that he saw no reason why his own son shouldn't be paid in money for the work that he did, or that it would be only fair to Carl, since he was now, you know, not in college that year, missing his senior year at Hope, by the way, working for his dad instead, that he would see to it that Carl would go away with some money. He says, I had saved up almost $840 from the wages my father paid me during the last 15 months I had worked for him. So I can't in my head divide 800 by 15, but it would be about 16. Yeah. $60 a month.
Did it also have to do with paying him, gave him to bring down the cost of running the farm and that for his income was an advantage. If the son just worked for nothing, then he can't claim that as an expense. And in order to justify the profits that came off the farm, you would pay whoever your employee was, whether child or not. We have that situation with our daughter-in-law. Our son pays her for what she does so that she can get Social Security benefits, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, when you said that, I didn't think of it as a generous offer. I thought of it as a financial situation.
Spoken like a true Dutch person.
I'm not Dutch. I haven't been raised in the Dutch store. Yeah, yeah. No.
I didn't mean that the way it sounded. Spoken like a true person who's looking at the practical side of things and how to stay completely within the law while looking at it as to what is best for you and your family. And so people sometimes pay their adult children because for tax purposes now.
My father wasn't the oldest son of farmers, and so he was exempt from going to the war, but his younger brother served in Germany and toward the end of the war, and he saw people coming out of concentration camps and how abused they had been. But my father was paid, I think, he probably after 18, and one advantage of that was to give him some income so that he could be able to marry somebody and offer them some sort of way to,
Yes.
you don't want to leave your children penniless. And so how can they, especially as men, find any kind of woman that will take him without some sort of income? And it so
Let's-
turned out that
Mhm.
after my mom and dad got married, he got the farm, but then he had to pay then to his brother and sister, an equivalent amount eventually, and it all got evened out fairly among the siblings. But it was helpful that when he did get married, then he was able to live on the farm and make a living for farming for a while. But farming was not for him. Eventually, he became a factory worker in
All
Grand
right.
Rapids.
But both Carl and his father are thinking about how to use the money they do have and what is the best way to use it. And the chaplain quickly says when he sees this new recruit come in and try to pay the church, that's because the church is running the camp, he doesn't want him to do that. He realizes the church needs to raise the money to run the camp because the workers are not being paid. Now, let's go one step behind that. Are the workers actually being paid by the farmers who are hiring them? So this farmer John down here needs some people to pick his apples. So he goes over to Camp Walhalla and he picks up a group of workers to come and work on his farm. Now, so does the farmer get free labor? No, he pays for it. Who does he pay? The US Treasury. So the workers are working for their country and not receiving payment for it. Now over here, we have workers who could have been doing similar jobs. They're in an army camp, they're in basic training and so forth. They're working for their country. Are they paid? Yes. So should the pacifists be paid? Well, that would be a huge political issue, wouldn't it? About whether Congress could pass any selective service law at all. Because you have too many people out there who say, what? You mean first they ducked the war, like Carl Verduin doesn't want to be a farmer and he doesn't want to be a soldier. So what is he going to do? And now we're going to pay him? They wouldn't be able to get it through Congress. So that's why I loved reading about this Brethren minister who sees everybody's situation and knows what their situation is and what's the best thing to do. So he discourages Carl from, and then you have to respect his father who says, my son's going into a peace camp and nobody knows what that involves. And if he has some money, he can protect himself better. If he has to pay for a fare to go someplace, they send him and there's no way to get there. He can buy himself a train ticket or whatever he needs to be okay with what he has agreed to do. So to me, it symbolizes his father's approval and at least willing to go along with his son in his decision. So although we'll come back to this in a few minutes because let's work our way through what happens next. But Doug Brower has a very interesting story about another story of a parent who supported their child in the pacifist choice, even though maybe the parent himself would have wished it went another way. So he participates in the apple harvest and, it's very human. Carl is not trying to lecture us on pacifism or the army or anything. He's just telling you what happened to him. And he's very wise in the beginning to really just tell us what happened. Some mornings when we picked apples, there was frost on them and our fingers would become numb from the cold. But oh, those frosty apples tasted good. Since they were the only compensation we received for our work, we felt justified to eat as many as we wanted. It's almost like a touch of humor. We could just gorge ourselves on apples all day. Apple harvest was soon over. Look at the transition. That phase passed by. And then I was assigned to work for another farmer who was harvesting his crop of pinto beans. What would happen if you gorged yourself on pinto beans? I don't know, but it might not be good. This involved following the mower, raking the bean plants into piles, and eventually forking them onto a wagon. We can see that. We see him in action. I couldn't help but see the irony that while my brothers were exempt from military service, his brothers Cornelius and Harold, while my brothers were exempt from military service so they could work on our father's farm, I was supposedly doing, quote, work of national importance, working for a farmer in Michigan, while my father hired someone else to take my place. And so he's giving you this kind of innocent picture of picking apples and it wasn't so bad, but he's looking at, but what does that mean in the bigger picture? Who's paying who and how is this all working out as a system? All right, so he's, now we're going to go to the second camp to which he goes, and that's Cascade Locks. And that's where the most development of the memoir takes place, because we have Cascade Locks through page 6, where we zero in on the kitchen at Cascade Locks. And then he's still at Cascade Locks describing what happens in the kitchen as he goes through that phase. And then on page 9, we go to a third camp, Bedford, which is where? Virginia. It's going down to Virginia, where again he was assigned to the kitchen. So we're going to go from the kitchen at Cascade Locks, which has been greatly developed because he was sort of the king of the kitchen by the time it came to the end. And we go to Cascade Locks and see what they were able to do with the kitchen down at Cascade Locks. And Carl's attitude is, you know, what we could do at Cascade Locks was a darn sight better than what they had going at Bedford. And but that's brief. And then another brief stay at College Park as the war is coming to a conclusion. And this is February of 1946. By the time he gets to College Park and stays in what was apparently formerly sort of a frat house situation. And we'll touch on that. And then a closing. So let's go back to Cascade Locks for a few minutes on page 4. Okay, yes. There is. Is this better? Because I can hold it. Would this be better and would this be entirely better? All right, I can hold it. There's no problem. Except the P's. I'll hold it out here. Now, he was only at Walla Halla for 6 weeks. So that was the honeymoon period there where he could gorge himself on apples and not have a difficult situation, really, except that he was corrected not to waste his money trying to pay the Church of the Brethren. They accepted the fact that the Church of the Brethren was doing this as their Christian duty. This is in Oregon. So the first thing that he experiences is to see an incredibly beautiful place in the country. How many military people that you know, as a result, may have had, you know, murder, mayhem, and all kinds of things, but did go to incredibly beautiful parts of the world that they had never seen before. Amazing experience of another place in the world. And so far, Carl has not, as far as I know, had never been away from south of Chicago in any way. All the men were sent to other camps. So whoever he might have gotten to know in Valhalla was now separated. There was no chance to develop rapport, esprit de corps, as they say. I and 4 others were sent to a camp near Cascade Lakes, Oregon. Located in the scenic Columbia River Gorge, we were given tickets to an obscure railroad siding called WWII, where the camp was located. The government at least paid for our train tickets. A train ticket from Illinois to Oregon might not have been that cheap in those days. It was nighttime when the train stopped in White. Now compare this to what it would be like if the army were officially moving part of their troops or their own recruits to a new location. They would not only have their way paid, but what else? It was nighttime when the train stopped in White. There was nothing there. No platform, no building, no lights. No one there to meet us. In one direction, we could see moonlight reflecting on the mile-wide Columbia River. We climbed up the embankment where the tracks ran, and from there we saw a couple of lights some distance away. After groping around a bit, we found a narrow gravel lane that led us toward the lights, which indeed were at that camp, but no one was awake. We banged on some doors until we raised someone. Apologies. They knew we were coming, but not exactly when. They found some empty beds for us and allowed us to sleep late the next morning. So that's a wow to me. It's a wow that just these 5 men that have now been reassigned, don't really know each other, have been assigned to this new camp. Total blackness. Just imagine yourself out on the shores of Lake Michigan, a body of water down there a mile wide, and 2 little lights way down there. Should you even go toward those lights? Do you really know what you're doing? Could you get lost by morning? Sure. So the use of detail is the type of thing that Ken Burns picks out when he puts together a documentary. You feel like you are right there. Where, when, what is happening, and then he's making a point each time. Each time he's giving you a picture, he's making a point about it, about his situation, that we weren't paid, but this is what it was. And so the so-called Cascade Lots was similar to Walhalla Camp. It too had been a CCC camp. I forgot what that CC is, but another type of, okay, Civilian Conservation Corps. And the work we did was for the Forest Service, some tree planting, some road and trail maintenance, but mostly we were available for firefighting. Do you see danger ahead? I mean, if you're going in because you don't want to have any danger, try becoming a firefighter. I arrived there in November 1943, just as the rainy season was beginning. I'm glad he gives that date, because as we trace this, we can relate it to what's going on in the war while Carl is doing this back home. And he's not going to stop and tell you that, but he's going to drop the date in so you can get a feeling if you know the war history. I'll never forget the first day I went out with the crew to plant trees on a steep mountainside. The day was clear and we were very near Mount Hood, which was in clear view. I have never seen anything so beautiful and majestic. The mountain loomed above us, pure white with a coat of new fallen snow. During our lunch break, we newly arrived Midwesterners all sat facing the mountain. We couldn't take our eyes off of it. It seemed almost close enough to touch. I was beginning to like CPAs. So he's giving you a sentence at the end of each paragraph that tells you, so what for him? He's starting to like CPAs. Now we come to the accident. How many of you did read the accident? They had a shock when you read about this accident that occurs. Okay. What was your main feeling about the accident? Where his leg gets terribly, one leg gets terribly broken.
Yeah, I get, he's exposed to danger here and he didn't realize it. And
Exactly.
his colleagues didn't realize it. It was not intentional, but it was an accident, but it gave him leisure. He was indisposed for what, months?
Yes, and we'll get to that in just a minute. There's going to be a huge result of this accident, which is the next turn in the story, leads to the next thing. So Carl has an amazing turn in his narrative where something terrible happens, and then you see an outcome that is mixed. But what happened in the accident? When I first heard the story of Carl coming down through the family lore, the reason for the accident wasn't clear in the story that was coming down. So my thought was, what would you think if your cousin or brother or whatever went to a pacifist's camp and all of a sudden there was an accident and his leg got broken? What would you wonder? Well, you have to be a suspicious type to wonder this, but look at the backlash that he got back in South Holland. And is he going to meet other people who have it in for the pacifists? I wondered if he was involved in some kind of work where, yes, the farmer was using their labor, but the farmer had it in for the pacifists. And all of a sudden, oh, sorry, you got a broken leg. You thought you weren't going to have to pay any price, and now you've got a broken leg. I was the I'm always looking behind it for maybe something you didn't think about, being in there. But that is not true. He explains it enough, but the reason for the accident is interesting. I think it was the 9th day I was at Cascade Locks when I was assigned to the crew that was gathering a supply of firewood for the winter, of which we needed an abundance. At the cabins, the cabins were heated with wood stoves, hot water for the laundry, the showers, and the kitchen was heated by wood fires and fuel for the kitchen ranges and ovens with wood. So when you glance back at this picture that Kathleen so skillfully put in right there about what the dwelling places were like at Cascade Locks, that they would have one building for quite a few people. It was like a bunkhouse or something. But that's a lot of wood. We believe that. We felled huge Douglas fir and hemlock trees. Is that safe for people who haven't sawed down trees before? No. First time my husband sawed down a tree, he smashed into the deck and ruined a lot of lumber. You don't necessarily know how to cut down a tree. Sawed their boles into 24-inch lengths, and then with wedges and mauls, we split these rounds into firewood-sized pieces. I was crouched on one knee, inserting a wedge, paying little attention to a truck that was circling around a woodpile behind me, when a rear wheel of the truck ran over my leg that was extended behind me. The driver, one of our crew, had irresponsibly failed to warn me that he was making such a close turn. Amazingly, I didn't feel any pain. This is going to describe, how it actually was to have this serious break. But the way he writes it, what does he say that's amazing here? Well, I got my leg broken because I didn't look behind me. I was kneeling down. I wouldn't accept blame like that. If he'd been in the Army, I say that crew would have been supervised by somebody who knew every inch of who needs to do what when a large piece of equipment is being backed up. I'll bet that in the Army, when they back up a big truck or anything, somebody is there watching out the back, because backing up into trouble is such a common cause of mistakes and, even worse than breaking a leg. How many of you agree with that? Yeah, in the Army, that probably would have been supervised. And here he's in a camp that's been put together out of, accidents do happen. And of course, the farm is a very dangerous place to work. The level of injuries on a farm is very high because farmers use heavy machinery and have all kinds of dangers. So felling huge trees is dangerous. Fighting fires is dangerous. I mean, they're doing work that the average citizen doesn't necessarily want to do without a lot of training. Amazingly, I didn't feel any pain as the wheel ran over my foot, but I could see immediately that my leg was broken just above the ankle. Some of the men devised rude splints to hold my foot in proper position. I was loaded onto the bed of a truck and taken to a hospital. A cast was put on my leg and I was put to bed in the infirmary back at the camp. A retired doctor who lived just up the road from camp had been hired to be the camp doctor, and he took over the management of my case. He visited camp almost every morning and routinely stopped to see how I was. So the doctor is being attentive. It's not that the doctor came once and then, disappeared. He prescribed that I should be confined to bed, not even to get up and go to the bathroom. One of our campers was in charge of the infirmary, and he brought me my meals, emptied my bedpan, and generally tried to keep me amused and comfortable. I can hardly believe it now in 1999 when he's writing this. But I was thus confined to bed for 11 weeks. Patty Brink, if your husband knew that somebody broke their leg and he's in a cast, would he put him in bed without moving for 11 weeks? What would happen if he did that? I want to know from anybody who knows this, what was standard good medical practice in 1943 if someone broke a leg? Would it be go to bed for 11 weeks and don't move? What would happen to your good leg? It would be completely atrophied in 11 weeks. You'd have no muscles at all in your other leg, right? So why would they do that? Of course, in 1943, if you were pregnant, you were supposed to sit in a chair most of the time, because if you even got up for a cup of tea, that would be exercising too much. I mean, he had an attitude, it's not that extreme, but it was you have to be very quiet because pregnancy is so stressful on your system that you can hardly move. And how has that changed today? Or even how had that changed by 20 years ago or 40 years? You have normal activity with just a few restrictions when you're pregnant, but you can pretty much carry on a normal life. So they treated, I guess there were many cases. My stepson had Perthes disease back in the 1970s, and he was put to bed for a whole year. And he was in 3rd grade. And even though his mother was attentive and people tried to come and visit him, the price that he paid as a child to be in bed for a whole year when he was that age was high. And he survived and he adjusted to it. But the amount of loneliness, and today they don't treat Perthes disease that way. They have other ways of addressing it that don't involve all that isolation and putting a child in that situation where it can't even go to school. So we have Carl 11 weeks, and 11 weeks is almost 3 months. And Carl says, I can hardly believe it now that I was treated that way. But I think it's an open question whether that doctor, he was retired, was his medical profession a little behind the times and he was prescribing that? Or was it that he knew that maybe the Church of the Brethren couldn't afford to put this young man into a real hospital, like a large hospital where he could get another kind of care? What would have happened if he were in the regular army? Yes. All right. The purpose of it, they did put a cast on. The purpose of a cast is to hold it stationary so that no matter what you do with the rest of your body, you can move around and keep your body healthy while that part is moving. So that's good. Good point. Thank you. Spoken just like a doctor's wife. Yes.
Isn't it also true that the culture within an army camp would be such with a lot of pressure to go back to serving as opposed to laying around? Like I think the culture of what that camp is compared to the culture within military service, where the expectations are high, as you get up and go. No one's going to let you lay around for 11 weeks.
All right. Good point. However, it's possible that that by some kind of rules, you either have to be working the job or in bed. And so the necessity to keep him in bed was because otherwise he can't get that in-between treatment that he needs to, whatever.
I think that perhaps the doctor and the patient with the broken leg had some things in common, and that the doctor said, thought to himself, this is a man with a great mind. We don't want to waste that mind in his possibly getting killed or burned in a fire. And so he was protective of him and maybe gave him things to read, and maybe they had good discussions, and the other guys maybe were not as good of conversation partners, let's say, or they were more they were more physical. Their bodies were important more so than their minds.
Interesting. That's very interesting. How about in a military base where there's a steady influx? I mean, this is in a combat situation. They have broken legs all the time. They have to, broken legs is like the ABCs of medical care so that whatever is the best treatment, that's what they would be receiving. That's what I believe, that the standard of medical care in the Army facilities for wounded veterans was the best they could possibly do in whatever the circumstances were. How many of you sort of agree with that from your experience or knowledge? How many of you think that the medical level of medical service in the service we would like it to be better?
I think it would vary depending on whether you were in a combat zone. If you were in a combat zone, I mean, the series MASH on TV, you remember some things in that, and depending on how close you were to some good medical care, you often didn't get very good care. You got the best they could offer, but it was very limited, very limited, very limited.
Anyway, Carl doesn't make any of these projections. He doesn't stop to complain about anything here. That's what I see. He's not complaining. In fact, he says, well, I didn't look behind me. If I had looked behind me, I never would have been run over by that truck. He's taking his own personal responsibility. That's pretty mature for the age that he is and what happened. Why didn't I or the infirmary attendant in the camp director challenge this absurdity? Why did the doctor do this to me? So all the questions that are occurring to us about why was he in bed alone for 11 weeks when he just got here and doesn't even have a friend in the world? And Carl is raising those questions himself, but he's just putting them as questions. Why didn't I or the infirmary attendant stand up for me, or the camp director, this chaplain, go to bat for him? I don't know. I only know it happened. That's he's not going to be able to answer why.
Did he ever talk about what type of fracture it was? And did he have problems as he aged?
He didn't. He actually, after the service, he was very active as a mountain climber, a hiker, a bicycler. He was pretty much unaffected in the long term. He did have a complete healing of that.
Well, that's good.
Because I was new at the camp, I hadn't made friends there yet. So it was rare that any of the men came to the infirmary to visit with me. Once in a while, there was another sick camper to one of the other beds for a day or two. But mostly I was alone and lonely. As might be expected, the infirmary attendant and I did become good friends, and this friendship has lasted until now. I love that sentence because he didn't have many friends. But does he have the capacity to make lifelong friendships in whatever situation he's in? Yes, obviously. And for some of the reasons that Judy was bringing up. The Columbia Gorge is one of the rainiest places in America. Most of the rain falling in the winter months, December, January, and February, the months I lay in bed in the infirmary. Now again, we're right there with him in this bed. No friends. This is it. I don't know when I'm going to get out of here and I can look at the rain. And this is almost poetic in the way it's written. Sometimes I had nothing to do but look out of the window and watch it rain. I had never seen the likes of it before. One time I recorded steady rain for 40 days and 40 nights. Now that has biblical implications, doesn't it? And I began to contemplate the fate of Noah. There we go. We knew Noah was going to be in him. I grew used to the sound of water coursing down the boulder-strewn creek that flowed along the border of our camp. A sentence that lets us just picture this. There was an unfamiliar, fascinating world out there beyond the walls of my prison infirmary, different than anything I had known in the Midwest, and I was impatient to get to know it better. So he brings such a beautiful result out of all these hours of watching it rain and being so, in a way, bored. Wow, there's a huge world out there that I don't understand yet. And I'm going to be part of it and have that. It's hope. It's like faith, hope, and love are at work. He loves the nature and he's looking at it. And, you know, I don't want to overdo this point, but he's making a point at the end of the paragraph. And that came true in his life. He was just a famous naturalist. He loved the redwood forests and the mountains and the scenes in California. Eventually the cast came off. But when I tried to lower my leg to the floor, the pain was excruciating. Has anybody here had to operate on one leg for a while because your other leg was bummed out and you had to keep off of it? Okay. For weeks, I still used crutches, but at least I was able to eat in the dining room with the other men, take showers, and go to the bathroom. Just the simplest things I finally got in this life. I needed a job to do. Now here's the transition. In my situation where I'm still on crutches, I needed a job to do. And one was found for me in the sign shop where I would paint lettering on Forest Service signs while sitting with my leg propped up on a stool. Now his literacy and his facility with language are beginning to come into play as he's painting these signs. One of the undesirable jobs at the camp was KP duty, kitchen patrol. Setting tables, serving food, clearing tables, washing dishes, which was done by hand. By now I could walk without crutches, and I was told I was needed in the kitchen. That began what developed as my exclusive occupation during the rest of my CPS days. So he's giving us a forecast that the rest of this is going to be about his time in the kitchen. He's on the way, never going to leave the kitchen. From dishwasher, I graduated to cook, then to kitchen coordinator, and later to camp baker. In the early days of CPS, it was necessary for cooks to be sent to a cooking school at a camp in Virginia. But maybe the Selective Service required it, or the Church of the Brethren required it, because you're fixing food for 150 people. You can't just do that by luck or by the seat of your pants. But later, these men were expected to train new recruits on the job. That's the way I learned. So he learned from someone who had been to the cooking camp in Virginia where people were trained. We might have anywhere from 50 to 120 men in the camp at one time. And that whole paragraph is introducing humor and human interest and a feeling that, it's going to be all right for Carl. He's going to find.
I was wondering, when he was through with all this and married, did he continue his cooking? Because John has a cousin that went through the same experience. He won't let his wife cook.
That's wonderful. And my brother's like that too. Even though they were both working through a lot of their middle years, Dirk is the cook. And I love going there for Thanksgiving and Christmas and so forth, because it's really wonderful. And Carl was like that too. Love large groups, yeah. And my father made most of our bread. My father would, because he too grew up in a family that had both been farm people. My grandfather was a minister, but he was a farmer one generation back. So, just the way Carl's mother at a typical lunch had her husband, her 6 children, and about 3 farm hands. And they all wanted a couple pieces of bread, So how many loaves of bread do you think it would take for a week in her household? Probably I could see 10 or 20 loaves of bread would be needed for a week, don't you? But that's not all there is to it. So is Carl going to be up to it to think about how the whole system works in the kitchen? Like, again, the practical thing we saw here about thinking about how best to use what the rules are that would be best for everybody. We might have anywhere from 50 to 120 men on the main camp at one time, depending on how many were placed in subsidiary side camps. Now, in this paragraph, he's going to describe just making lunch that people are going to take in a lunchbox going out to fight fires. So a healthy man fighting fires will need at least 3 sandwiches for lunch. If you have 120 men and they each need 3 sandwiches, 3rd grade math, how many sandwiches do you need? 360. And they'd like a little variety, please. So what do you have? And so we see humor here, but also another quality that Carl is showing. And how do you see that? What kind of sandwiches do you make day after day? Maybe a meat sandwich, a cheese sandwich, and a peanut butter sandwich. To vary the choice, the next day it might be a jelly sandwich, a meat sandwich, and a cheese sandwich. Another day we might start with a cheese sandwich and then meat and then a peanut butter sandwich, etc., etc. So everybody's laughing. These lunches packed in a large wooden box and loaded onto a truck. In the evening, the box would be returned to the kitchen for use again the next day. 360 sandwiches. One day, the box came back with a cryptic message painted on its cover, Hebrews 13:8. What in the world did that mean? We had no trouble finding a Bible in the camp and turning to the designated verse, which Carl could do automatically, of course. Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. As I mentioned, the churches were responsible for providing our food, a major burden for them. For the churches, here's Carl worrying about the churches that have to manage. They're just a church. Did they have the managers to be able to run a camp like this and keep everybody alive and safe? Sometimes we'd receive food that a brethren farmer had raised himself, potatoes or dried beans or other non-perishable foods. Now and then we would receive a delivery of home canned fruits or vegetables that had put up by the ladies of the churches. How many of you had mothers or grandmothers who canned things? Did canning? Oh yeah, it's part of the program. This was wartime, and many food items were rationed, such as meat, sugar, butter, etc. These items could only be purchased with coupons issued by the federal government, ration coupons. And each person was entitled to only a limited number of coupons. We learned to sweeten all our desserts with honey, which was not rationed. Obtaining enough meat was crucial. Our camp was very fortunate to have access to a farm where we raised cattle, hogs, and chickens, as well as vegetables. So now we're going, wow, the camp has its own farm. They're actually a farmer themselves. So they're going to be all right. 2 workhorses were also kept on the farm. Right into the late 1940s, my grandfather had both workhorses and the latest tractor. How many of you remember that time when it was both horses and tractors and the other modern machinery involved? Yeah. There were certain turns the tractor couldn't make that the horses could maneuver and stuff like that. When I was kitchen coordinator, I was responsible for ordering the food we needed from town and for making out weekly menus utilizing what was on hand. The men in the farm did the butchering, so they largely determined what meat would be available from week to week. Now you're seeing major butchering going on. You have in mind 120 hungry men from quite hard work. I'm still stunned at how much my 17-year-old son could put down without gaining any weight, and just because he was pretty active. It's mind-boggling, isn't it? You can't believe what a healthy person can put down at that age. So how many of you read this kitchen section as one of your favorite parts of this memoir? Because it really shows. what the camp was like and what Carl was part of achieving here. So early on, he had said in the very beginning that he can't accept any authority. What did he say about himself on page 1? He said, I wanted to follow a different star. I feared and resented regimentation and coercion of any kind. Does that sound like somebody who can go into management and think about everybody's needs and go through all this to set up a system that effectively as possible takes care of everyone that he's responsible for? He just matured. And here he is, coming into his own. As you said, he has these abilities and they're starting to rise, even if it's graduated from dishwasher to, the next level up.
I think he finally got to the point he wasn't thinking about his decision that he made earlier and thinking how I'm contributing now. Before that, I think he was kind of floating around and didn't know where this was going to go. And all of a sudden, taking care of that many people, organizing, he's got to manage.
All right. And then the ability, if he hates being just told to do something,
But now he is
then
being
he
told,
knows these guys also hate to just be told to do something. They have to understand the reason.
yeah,
And they're all about creating community.
yeah. Well, they seem to eat much better than C rations, which I had once.
Yes. Much better than C rations. And what do we mean by C rations? Just the same old thing in a little tin can or something. A few cigarettes, yeah. But our camp was fortunate to have access to a farm. So now he's in charge of ordering the foods that they need. He's starting to be responsible for a pretty big budget here. And he's got to make his dollar go as far as possible. Another thing every homemaker starts thinking about, what's another recipe I can make with potatoes? From the town, and for making out the weekly menus, make out a menu for the whole week. When I was in graduate school, four of us tried to get along through a week on as little money as possible. We each had, a grant from the university of a certain amount. And we were trying to come in under that amount so we could save a little money. There were 2 women from Hope and 2 women from Calvin in this group, and we worked together very well. But we would each take a turn for 1 week. And I do remember that each of us had to put in $17 a week. So 4 times 17 is $68 for these women. And then you would have your turn, Patty. It's your week. So with $68, what are you going to buy that you can use and reuse and stretch to a couple more meals, and you'll make a couple of casseroles. And at the end of the week, you'll make a cream sauce and put in whatever is left. But you're going to try to make it through the week on that budget. And it was really kind of fun. Whereas if we had alternated day by day, then we couldn't do the week planning. So you really would make a week menu of what you could do each week with what you bought and see if you can make it good, to some kind of decent standard. So this is what Carl is doing. The men on the farm did the butchering. So they too are part of making the most of it. If they have a pig, how much of the pig can you use? Well, maybe you can use some things that some people would throw away, and make the most of the meat available. Thanksgiving and Christmas were the 2 most gala days of the year in the camp. All the men from the side camps came to main camp, and any wives or girlfriends who were in the vicinity were invited for the holiday feast. This was a big deal. The dining room was decorated with green boughs, of which we had a plentiful supply from the lush forest surrounding our camp. I would confer with the farm manager well in advance to anticipate what meat would be available for our holiday menu. And now we find out what that's going to be. So now look how much community has developed here. Everybody's making jokes all the time, and they're, just this. Every Tom, Dick, or Harry is going out into the forest to gather some boughs because it'll make the dining room look better when he invites his girlfriend to come over for the Christmas dinner, One year, the farm men were reluctant to tell me what meat we might expect for the Christmas dinner. So they're kind of joking around with Carl. You're not going to believe what we're going to bring you this time. With teasing smiles and winks, they would only say, wait and see. Finally, the secret came out. There had been a litter of pigs born some weeks earlier, and the farmers were going to supply us with suckling pigs. Well, how big is a suckling pig? Suckling means the pig is still feeding on its mother's milk. Kind of like less than 2 feet from head to tail, right? Okay. But you use everything. Well, none of us cooks had had any experience preparing suckling pig. Turning to our Forest Service cookbooks was no help at all. There's nothing in there about piglings. We knew only that it was customary to roast suckling pig whole, head and all. We were too proud to demur, meaning turn that down. So we took the challenge. We stuffed each small carcass with seasoned walnut and orange peel dressing, baked them in a slow oven, basted them assiduously with a honey and sage marinade, and pinched them often to see if they were done. Look at how skillful Carl is in becoming the great, grand chef with assiduously and marinade, and he knows what he's talking about. Finally, they developed a golden brown crust and gave off an enticing aroma. Nothing smells better than pork, roasted pork, when you come into a house on a cold day, right? We put a small red apple in the mouth of each one, placed it on a large platter, surrounded it with spiced baked apples, and with appropriate fanfare, marched into the dining room, holding the platters high above our heads. The diners were enthralled. Never had we cooks had such compliments, and that Christmas meal was talked about for months. Again, look what food can do. If you want to start a church, bring food. If you want to get young people together, if you want to attract the college students, put on a supper. We had all kinds of men in CPS. And now you're going to get a better picture of what were the other people like. Who was he meeting, and what was the typical pacifist about? And he doesn't give us an idea that they're all heady philosophers meditating in their silent places. He gives you quite a varied picture. From conservative Mennonite farmers, there's the mention of Mennonites. And I'm suggesting that Carl was particularly aware of Mennonites because his uncle Leonard was really serious about the Mennonite denomination and working with them in scholarship. To free thought liberals with PhDs, free thought liberals with PhDs would be, college professors, I guess. Jehovah's Witnesses, Quakers, Methodists, Christian Scientists, Buddhists, Catholics, and agnostics. Of course, there are many brands of agnostic too. At Barnes and Noble, I actually found a book called 7 Kinds of Atheism. And it was like a subtitle, like, well, if you are tired of Buddhism, here's another idea, 7 kinds of atheism. Almost many lost Oh, almost many lifestyles were represented. We had quite a few vegetarians, and that required an accommodation in our menu planning. We also had a special table for vegetarians where we served a meatless main dish. Look how accommodating they are to the opinions of somebody else that you may not agree with. But we had a couple of men in camp who would eat nothing but raw fruits and vegetables. They graciously didn't bother us. And they never came to the dining room at mealtime, but ate on their own, usually in the dormitory or some other building. I never knew for sure where they got their food, but they were resourceful. One day, while dinner was underway in the dining hall, I had some need to go to the laundry building for something. I don't remember what. I walk in on these two men seated on chairs facing each other. Now picture this again. We are right there. These two guys are sitting on two chairs facing each other, with a bushel basket of lettuce and dandelion greens between them, munching away like rabbits. It was something I'll never forget. Now, is he hateful of these vegetarians? No, he's just accepting and kind of amused. One of these men was a silent, reserved type, renowned for his diligence and ability to outwork anybody in the camp. See, he gets to know the character of the people that he knows. And just because somebody is very silent or somebody you might shun, he thinks more about it. The other was just the opposite, gregarious, cheerful, and funny. He never shaved or cut his beautiful wavy black hair, which he kept scrupulously clean. He eschewed all leather products such as belts, shoes, and gloves. For reasons I never fully understood, he usually went barefoot when he sometimes wore cloth or rubber shoes. So a detail like that, Carl is still remembering until the years later when he tells his war stories. Now, these are Carl's war stories in a way. Thinking about the way that men who have been to a real war talk or don't talk about their experiences, I've heard so often that the most terrible things are not talked about when they come back home. They may be remembered, they may turn up in their dreams, they may have post-traumatic stress from all this, but they're probably not in their stories. They're looking for stories like the time we circled our helicopter around the Eiffel Tower and amusing things like that. Do you wonder whether Carl had a dark side that he's not telling about here as he tells about fun in the kitchen and the roast pigs and so forth? I don't think so, because I think he's trying to be honest with his children and grandchildren. As they're growing up or they're adults, they can handle adult material. You can tell, you can say so if you had some kind of real crisis through this. But he has convinced us that they had all kinds of men in CPS, because we can picture two men sitting in two chairs facing each other like this, like these two stools and a bushel of greens between them. And they do that every single day. And one of those men is very quiet, but the other one is cheerful and talkative. So I guess they get along well. As kitchen coordinator, I had the enviable privilege of not having to accompany firefighting crews and cook for them in the field. And then he talks a little bit about what it was like to cook in the field. And we'll skip that paragraph to go ahead because we are going to get through the rest of this. He just describes in the hardships of the field, you still have to feed that many people and find a way to actually cook something, build an oven on the spot, on the site. What do you have to bring? What do you have to do? How is it managed? After serving as kitchen coordinator for about a year, I had a chance to take the place of the man who was the camp baker. Now Carl's going to go into the whole field of making bread and a whole lot more, pastries and pies, and calling on every pie or pastry that his mother knew how to make. Now, does Carl's mother probably know how to make like apple pie, apple crisp, apple baked apples, apples galore, and all kinds of fruit, because there's a lot of fruit in that region, and also cans things. So some of this is coming from his mother, but a lot of it is not. A lot of it is from the Forest Cookbook, Forest Service Cookbook, and other training that he's getting from other people about how to cook for a huge crowd. Then he tells of an incident on page 8 in the middle. That's not in the kitchen. About this time, I made a bus trip to La Pine. He was at a friend who was in a CPS camp there. I bought a round trip ticket on the Greyhound bus. On my return trip, I had to transfer at the Dales to another bus. As I presented my ticket to the bus driver, he looked at it and said, "You're going to Wyeth?" I said, "That's right." He handed the ticket back to me and said, "There's no room on this bus for your kind." And he wouldn't let me aboard. I couldn't think anything I could do except to try to hitchhike back to camp. I walked to the edge of town and put out my thumb. Very promptly, a car stopped and I got in. The driver was headed for Portland and therefore could transport me all the way to Wyeth, which was on his way. As we sped along the highway, we passed the Greyhound bus that I should have been on. So I had the last laugh and got to Wyeth by bus instead. So he didn't get mad or go try to have the police intervene because he had a ticket or anything. He just puts up with it, hitchhikes his way, and beats the bus, which is a real satisfaction. One thing I remember about that camp is the family of porcupines. We hung around and begged food from us. And there was one meal I'll never forget. About twice a week, a fresh meat supply would be delivered to the main camp, and whatever arrived, I of course fixed it for dinner. And then he withholds what that meat was, and it turns out the meat is horse meat. They butchered one of the farm horses last week, he says in the middle paragraph. The Forest Service foreman who was at the table had a piece of meat on his fork and was lifting it to his mouth. See, we're right there. We can picture this. He froze, put his fork down, and left the table. I'll never forget the look on his face. I and all the cooks sent stern objections to the men on the farm, and you can be sure there was never any horse meat served out of my kitchen again. Who's in charge now? Who's in authority now? Carl, and he's giving an order, and they better follow it. You know, he's not against authority. He's enjoying his own authority when it really counts. Bedford. Now we're going to have a very strong contrast with what's going on in Virginia. And this is actually one of my favorite parts of the memoir too, just the choice to include Virginia. He could have skipped over Virginia. It wasn't very important and he wasn't there for a really long time. But he's got it in there because it is a total contrast to what was created at Cascade Locks. There were rumors that our camp was going to be closed, and in February of 46, see, the war is over in 46. I was transferred to a camp near Bedford, Virginia, when again I was assigned to the kitchen. But what a shock I received there. The difference between Cascade Locks and Bedford was unbelievable. At Cascade Locks, we served tasteful, attractive meals, always trying for some special novelty or piquant flavoring to stimulate the appetite. Salads were our specialty. But at Bedford, the men wouldn't eat salads, nor anything with a novel flavor. Vegetables had to be cooked until they were mushy, and then had to be served in a gummy cream sauce. The whole time I was there, we never served any vegetable that wasn't cream. At Cascade Locks, we had stimulating programs of intellectual inquiry and cultural entertainment. Don't think Carl wasn't part of that too. We had, because he came from Hope College, you know. We had musicians, poets, teachers, dramatists, philosophers among us who always kept things lively. A philosopher keeps things lively? Well, yeah, for Carl, it could. And these other entertainers and teachers and poets and dramatists weren't all that bad either. Never underestimate the ordinary man who's never been to a drama or an opera before. Never underestimate what they love and will respond to. Some of the men created and performed a parody they called the Mikado of CPS. Wow, with lyrics they wrote themselves. A production of Chekhov's The Seagull was rehearsed and staged for the men at camp and many invited guests from the outside. We had piano concerts, vocal concerts, study groups on general semantics and Freudian psychology, and endless discussions on pacifism, religion, politics, and every social concern imaginable. At Bedford, the men spent their evenings lying on their cots, their radios blasting with sentimental Appalachian folk music, and always with the theme of unrequited love, each tuned to a different station. The din was unbearable. Nobody read any book except the Bible in Bedford, nor talked about anything except trivia of the day. I was miserable at Bedford. I shuddered to think how different my CPS experience would have been had I spent it all in that depressing environment. Fortunately, I spent only about 2 months there. So this is in here for a reason. It just really highlights what whoever it was who had created this, what was the reason that the camp at Cascade Ponds had such a startling difference with what went on in Bedford. It wasn't under the Army at all, so it had nothing to do with Army discipline or the spirit or training of the generals in the Army. It had to do with, to me, people like Carl, enough people like Carl who cared about other people and had some skills and could think about the good of everyone. Not to be Sunday schoolish, but you see a dramatic thing here between these two camps. Now we'll go to College Park. Before I was transferred to Bedford in February of 46, I had applied for an assignment to be a cook at a detached service unit at College Park, Maryland. Someone else got that job then, and I was tapped to take his place. There were about a dozen men at College Park living in what had been a fraternity house at the University of Maryland. Okay, we get that picture, don't we? They worked for a research project being conducted by the Agriculture Department, which was measuring the effectiveness of wartime diets on a herd of dairy cows. Various cows were on different diets, and everything they ate was carefully weighed and monitored. Then each cow's milk production was also carefully evaluated for quantity, fat content, and correlated with her diet. I guess the cows were weighed regularly too. The CPS men were busy with all these chores. I was their cook, except on my days off when one of the other men filled me in. Every chance I had, I would take a bus to Washington, D.C. and spend the day enjoyably exploring all the wonderful public buildings, museums, and monuments of that beautiful city. Remember when he was sitting watching the rain and thinking there's a big world out there for me to enjoy, and being just stunned at the beauty of Cascade Mountains. And now, even though he's in the process of going home, and he could be just sitting in his bunk writing letters to his sweetheart and getting some from her and just longing for the day that he can go home, he's not longing for the day that he can go home, because now he has trepidation about going home, just like he had trepidation heading into this life. My most memorable experience at College Park. And now we're going to see what I think of as a metaphor. I don't think Carl meant it that way, but I think it's an effective memoir that turns into the end of the story. My most memorable experience at College Park occurred one morning when I went into the kitchen to prepare breakfast and found it swarming with winged termites. There were thousands of them, and they were into everything. Previous to that day, I had never seen a termite on the premises. I guess they all emerge at a given signal and begin a frenzied mating orgy or something. That old fraternity house must have been riddled with termites, and it was a wonder it hadn't collapsed. I called some of the other men, and we all began to sweep up and mop up and vacuum up termites. They were in the drawers and in the cabinets and in every nook and cranny, on the walls and on the ceiling and flying through the air. Needless to say, breakfast was delayed that day. So we have a little laugh at the end of the paragraph on that one too. Can you imagine this? How many of you have ever been in a situation where you were just overwhelmed with insects, in a situation where you got to get rid of these buggers? I did in graduate school days, I did live in one place where there were just mice in the whole building. There's nothing you could do about it. There is nothing you could do about it. So we would set traps in the kitchen. And then, because we were all girls, we decided that there is one thing that is a man's work. And we would tap on the apartment across the hall and tell the boys that they needed to come over and dump out our mouse traps. And there would be a reward because we would fix breakfast for them. And so that's the only thing you can do is try to get somebody, online to clear your traps. And there were a lot of mice. As amazing as their sudden appearance was, so was their sudden disappearance. I think it's a metaphor for, if you want to go to original sin, you can say there's always these ugly things that are just a complete disaster and could ruin everything are there in the woodwork all the time. Once in a while, they're going to come out and you're just going to see it. It's part of life. It's there. It's in every character. It's in every person. You just never, it's just you deal with what happens. You don't have a big philosophy about it or something like that. But that's my addition. That's probably not what Carl meant. He was just telling an amusing story to come into the last part of his narrative. As amazing as their sudden appearance was, so was their disappearance. The next morning, there were only maybe a dozen, and that was it. I suppose, though, that they were still gnawing the building to pieces where they couldn't be seen. That's like evil, too. There's always, the potential for evil at all times, in human nature. Finally, it came my turn to be discharged from CPS. This was in the first week of June, 1946. You might have thought that I would have immediately returned home, but I didn't. I had grown so enamored with Washington, D.C. that I couldn't leave it until I had seen all the wonders. But there's also something else going on here. What is waiting for him back in South Holland? And to answer that, I'm going to now distribute the appendix. Sorry. So easy to get. Meanwhile, back at home, Joanne Harlberg is waiting for Carl. And she is the sweetheart that he had in the beginning that we read about, when her father at one point told Carl, there's no, get off of my property. So he had been, hurtfully shunned by the father of his sweetheart. So now we're going to take a look at what was happening in that family while Carl is experiencing all this. And Joanne's brother had gone to war. And Kathleen Verduin sent me this information that's in the appendix just about a week ago. So I did not know this detail about the family until just a couple of weeks ago. So I decided to introduce it now to give you a minute to read this. Like all war stories, people circulate war stories. Did you know so-and-so? What's the first thing a veteran asks another veteran? Well, what service were you in? What unit were you in? Where did you serve? More than did you kill anybody? That's a forbidden question or a difficult question, but where were you is what people want to know. Okay, so we're seeing the descendants of Johnny Perlberg's veteran comrades, still remembering him years and years later. And she's telling how this comes down in their family, that Johnny Perlberg was blown apart 4 feet away from her father, blown apart. And he's not up in the air, he's on the ground at the airfield. And just a bomb falls and it hits him and he's blown apart, and the person 4 feet away escapes. But that can happen. And so you think of this is in the family memory, and that's Carl's sweetheart's brother. So he's coming home to the family that lost Johnny. And Johnny, I don't think Johnny was killed until 1944. So in the first part of Carl's time in service, Johnny hadn't died yet. He was serving in the army. But in 1944, he was in Corsica when this happened. And the US Air Base at Corsica is a very interesting base because it changed hands several times, and the Germans had it at one time, and the Italians and the American, and then the Allies. So he's afraid that when he comes home, his father-in-law, Joanne's father, isn't going to be able to cross the bridge and come into approving of this marriage. But it doesn't turn out that way, because Perlberg's father does say to his relatives, he drives over to the Verduin farm and he says, I think I want to talk to Carl. And so they sit down on the porch and they make peace. And he understands that his father-in-law treasures the living and remembers the dead, and that they both have come to a new place.
I've been thinking, this isn't the complete memoir, or is this the complete?
This is the end of his memoir. He did write other things. He wrote a biography of his father, but he wrote this memoir as this piece. And it's interesting that he didn't choose to put the information about Johnny into his memoir, because of course he's writing it in 1999 and he could have.
I just have another comment.
Yeah.
Coming from a religious family as he did, which probably had, I think you mentioned before, prayer before and after meals and Bible reading, that there's no mention of that in these writings. No. And I wonder in the camps if they might have had prayer before meals.
I believe that chaplains in the camps pray with men who want to pray, but do not press prayer on anyone. Would that be correct, Doug? That
Oh, I
if
don't
your
know.
understanding, that it's my understanding that the chaplains are advised to, they pray when they are requested to pray. And they need to be able to pray in the language of that person, in the religion of that person. Like if a Jewish person asks for prayer, the chaplain should be able to pray in his framework. You don't try to put Jesus into the prayer because you're a Christian. And the same with a Buddhist, and the same with who's an agnostic. You just have whatever kind of prayer you can.
But he doesn't mention any of
He
that.
doesn't mention anything
Right,
about
which I think is a little bit surprising coming from his environment.
Right. Okay. Well, go ahead.
You maybe sent this in the email message, but for the rest of us and me who don't quite remember what I just read maybe a couple of days ago, could you tell us what happened to Carl? Did he go back to to complete his education? What did he do for his
Yes, he
vocation
did.
or profession?
Okay. He stayed in, as he says at the end, he had met some social worker people in CPS, and he was pretty sure that was going to be his career choice. So he stayed in the West. He stayed in California, and he worked for a year or two to have money to go to college. Of course, he came out with no money, and the money he had, the 870 that he had saved, had been needed during his 3 years. So he worked for a year or two to earn money to go back to college, and he went to UCal Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, and earned a master's degree in social work. And then he became a social worker for the state of California, specializing in wards of the state. In other words, teenagers who'd been taken out of their families or had no family. And now they were the responsibility of the state. And so you can imagine what the task as he became a psychology major and had a degree in social work. And so he did marry Joanne. He did come home to South Holland and made peace with his father-in-law and was at peace, of course, the whole time with his own family. And he knew after the war that were many people in South Holland who had, if they were against him in the beginning, now understood more than they did before. And he lived his life in California. He had, I think nobody hurt him more than his old Sunday school teacher did. And his pastor, who had counseled him as a teenager about his feelings, his troubled feelings about war. And he thought his pastor understood him. But when the pastor was to lead a celebration with the congregation of those who were serving in war, he did not include Carl. And he, when you know a person ahead of time is not on your side, that's okay, you can deal with that in a way. But when someone you thought understood you turns around and breaks your heart, that is very hard. That's harder to take. So his father-in-law and he made up. His and then the Sunday school teacher who would teach him for more than a decade, he puts that in there. He had been in her Sunday school class for 10 years. And she had a party and excluded him. So he couldn't go back to South Holland religious environment. He just couldn't go back to that. So I believe that he found what he could in California in terms of fellowship in a church or church-like community. I do not think he became an atheist or forswore the entire faith or anything like that. I think he had a faith that did not fit in South Holland. And that's the way I would explain it. And then the Reformed Church is active in California, but not where he lived. And so he was, in my opinion, he was like a prophet in the church or a thinker in the church. And like A.J. Muste, though, he had to leave the specific Reformed background that he came from.
Did he become a member of any organized denomination or church?
I am not sure about that. When the relatives would visit, when his parents would visit them, they would go to church. He willingly went to church on those occasions for his relatives' sake. But he himself did not join, as far as I know, but I'm not sure about this. And what does joining mean anyway? I mean, you can be an adherent. You can be, even John Calvin describes the invisible church and questions whether every person who's in the church is also in the faith, and questions whether some people are outside the church, but they are in the faith in a larger way. So I like to think of it like that, because there is love all the over in here. And there's forgiveness and there's understanding. Now, Doug, I'd like, even though it's a minute late, if you want to stay, Doug has a very interesting story about a parent supporting a young man who wants to apply for, go ahead.
Very briefly, as a 17-year-old, I could not know what was going on in my father's mind, but I was exploring some of this too at the time as a 17-year-old, and my father, a World War II veteran, well, he accompanied me to the draft board for my hearing. And as I say, I hard to know what was going through his mind at the time. He stood by me, right? And when my own pastor would not come to the draft board with me.
See,
Anyway.
just like the pastor back in South Holland, he couldn't publicly acknowledge that he was supporting Carl in a ceremonial way. I mean, they were giving out Bibles and there was no Bible for Carl. They didn't give Carl a Bible, and that hurt him. And probably the people who did that never really thought it through. They never really thought what they were doing to a person by that symbolic thing. You know, And so with you, it's the pastor who absolutely could not take a public position for you.
He wrote a letter on my behalf. He thought I was sincere but misguided.
Sincere but misguided. Okay. I guess all of us are sincere but misguided. Certain. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's one reason that he says in the beginning, I was innocent and naive as a young man. So that's an admission when he's 78, that he had experiences to go through and things to learn that would widen his understanding of people and by implication. And then he has met chaplains and clergy during the war that seriously helped him, defended him, and helped create the community that he was trying to create. So that's another indication that you have to be careful about saying what it is that he left behind and what it is that he still endorsed and belonged to.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming back.